By the time officials noticed the absence of noise, a man had already spent days without speaking, unanswered, unseen, and increasingly disoriented inside a sealed cell. Silence was not accidental here. It was enforced, measured, and prolonged, becoming a condition that shaped behavior, broke routines, and altered outcomes long before anyone intervened. This happened inside Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, a sprawling maximum security prison whose isolation practices became central to daily control during the late 20th century. Long before headlines focused on violence, administrators relied on quiet confinement, restricted movement, and communication limits to manage thousands of incarcerated men housed far from public scrutiny. At Angola, silence functioned as policy, not metaphor, embedded in disciplinary housing, lockdown procedures, and daily routines designed to minimize contact between prisoners, staff, and the outside world. The consequence was predictable yet underexamined. Extended quiet amplified stress, distorted perception, and created conditions where mental deterioration often advanced without visible incident or immediate medical response. During the 1970s and 1980s, Angola expanded the use of segregation units, where prisoners could spend months or years with minimal conversation and limited human interaction. These units, often justified as necessary for order, relied heavily on silence. Meals passed through slots, movement tightly scheduled, and speech discouraged by physical separation and procedure. Official records emphasized safety and discipline, but internal reports and later investigations acknowledged rising psychological strain among those held in prolonged isolation without meaningful communication. For many incarcerated men, silence became cumulative, not momentary, eroding sleep patterns, concentration, and emotional stability, while leaving few outward signs demanding immediate intervention. Yet administrators believed the system was working, until unexpected incidents began surfacing, raising uncomfortable questions about what prolonged quiet was actually producing behind locked doors. Angola's size amplified the effect, with thousands confined across a former plantation landscape, where distance itself limited oversight and normalized separation between people and accountability. Communication restrictions extended beyond cells, affecting mail delays, controlled visitation, and monitored phone access, further reducing opportunities for prisoners to maintain social anchors outside prison walls. Silence, in this context, was layered, combining physical isolation with bureaucratic delay, creating long stretches where individuals existed with little confirmation they were still being heard. Mental health services at the time were limited, understaffed, and reactive, often responding only after behavior visibly deteriorated or disciplinary violations forced attention from staff. Former prisoners later described the quiet as heavier than noise, reporting confusion, heightened anxiety, and difficulty reintegrating even brief conversations once restrictions eased inside units. Such accounts align with broader research on solitary confinement, though Angola's practices unfolded largely away from sustained national attention during those incarceration policy years. Still, something changed when incidents involving self-harm, medical emergencies, and disciplinary breakdowns began quietly accumulating within the same silent housing blocks over repeated months. Internal reviews questioned whether enforced quiet reduced violence or simply displaced it inward, manifesting as psychological crises rather than visible conflicts between incarcerated individuals. Despite these concerns, the structure remained largely intact, supported by tradition, resource constraints, and a prevailing belief that silence equaled control within correctional administration culture. Public understanding lagged behind reality, as Angola's remote location and restricted access limited independent observation of daily conditions inside segregation units for journalists and advocates. That separation mattered, because when silence harms without witnesses, responsibility becomes diffuse, timelines blur, and accountability often arrives late within prison systems. By the late 20th century, Angola faced mounting legal scrutiny, with lawsuits challenging isolation conditions and their effects on mental health among incarcerated populations. These challenges forced administrators to document practices more carefully, revealing how silence had been operationalized as routine discipline rather than exceptional measure for decades. Records showed predictable patterns. Longer isolation correlated with increased mental health referrals, medication use, and behavioral incidents once confinement ended by institutional data. Yet reforms moved slowly, constrained by funding limits and entrenched practices, while men already subjected to prolonged quiet continued cycling through the same units. The most troubling realization emerged later. Silence had not prevented harm. It often concealed it until damage became unavoidable within institutional reporting structures. For those confined, the absence of sound marked time itself, with days measured by routine interruptions rather than conversation or meaningful engagement with others. Angola's experience reflected a broader national debate about solitary confinement, but its scale and duration made the consequences especially pronounced for affected individuals. As awareness grew, so did resistance from those who viewed silence-based control as indispensable, setting the stage for conflict between reform efforts and institutional inertia. This tension defined Angola's transition period, where acknowledging harm meant reconsidering decades of accepted practice across one of America's largest prisons. What administrators confronted next would test whether silence could remain a tool of control once its consequences were fully documented by courts and investigators. Before reforms took shape, however, the prison continued operating under existing rules, leaving many still subject to the same quiet conditions without relief. Documentation from this period shows a system aware of risks, yet hesitant to dismantle methods long equated with order and efficiency. For incarcerated men, the impact was personal and ongoing, as silence shaped memory, behavior, and the capacity to reconnect once restrictions lifted. By the time attention finally shifted, the question was no longer whether silence worked, but how much damage it had already done inside Angola's walls. Legal filings and expert testimony began reframing silence as a measurable risk factor, challenging long-held assumptions within correctional policy circles nationwide. Angola's administrators responded cautiously, balancing compliance with resistance, while monitoring how changes might affect security, staffing, and institutional routines. For those still confined, daily life remained quiet, structured, and isolating, reinforcing the reality that policy shifts often lag behind lived experience. Chapter 1 ends where consequences linger, with silence firmly established as both tool and threat within Louisiana State Penitentiary's walls during this period. The first major shift came not from inside the cells, but from outside pressure, when lawsuits and federal oversight began forcing Angola to justify practices long considered internal matters. At Louisiana State Penitentiary, administrators now faced scrutiny that questioned whether enforced silence preserved order or quietly accelerated psychological harm among incarcerated men held in isolation. Court filings detailed months without meaningful conversation, limited mental health evaluations, and disciplinary extensions that compounded isolation without clear behavioral justification or periodic reassessment. What unsettled officials most was not the criticism itself, but the documentation, showing patterns repeated across years, units, and individuals, suggesting systemic reliance on silence rather than isolated misuse. Internal audits revealed segregation placements often extended automatically, with reviews conducted on paper while physical conditions inside cells remained unchanged for prolonged periods. This marked the first major reveal. Silence was not simply an environment. It was an administrative shortcut that reduced interaction demands on staff while shifting consequences onto incarcerated individuals. As oversight intensified, administrators began compiling data that inadvertently exposed the scale of quiet confinement and its correlation with mental health incidents. Reports showed spikes in anxiety-related diagnoses, medication prescriptions, and crisis interventions following extended isolation, even among prisoners with no prior mental health history. The contradiction became unavoidable. The very policy intended to stabilize the institution appeared to generate emergencies that strained already limited medical resources. Staff testimonies acknowledged that prolonged quiet often preceded sudden behavioral breakdowns, creating moments of instability that required force or emergency response. Yet these incidents were rarely framed as outcomes of silence, instead recorded as individual failures or unpredictable episodes within official disciplinary logs. Advocates challenged this framing, arguing that isolation removed normal coping mechanisms, leaving individuals unable to regulate stress once interaction abruptly resumed. As hearings progressed, Angola was compelled to adjust certain procedures, introducing nominal increases in out-of-cell time and periodic mental health check-ins. On paper, These changes suggested reform, but implementation proved inconsistent, with staffing shortages and security priorities limiting actual daily interaction. Former prisoners later described these adjustments as symbolic, noting that silence still dominated daily experience despite revised policy language. What followed surprised even experienced observers. Some incarcerated men reacted negatively to restored interaction, struggling with speech, trust, and sensory overload after long isolation. Medical evaluations confirmed this difficulty, documenting delayed responses, fragmented communication, and heightened agitation when silence abruptly ended. These findings complicated reform efforts, raising a new question. Had silence reshaped behavior so deeply that reversing it introduced new risks? Administrators now face a dilemma, balancing gradual reintegration against security concerns, while acknowledging that prolonged quiet had lasting psychological effects. The institution responded cautiously, implementing tiered interaction schedules that reintroduce conversation incrementally rather than abruptly. However, oversight bodies question whether these measures address root causes or merely manage symptoms without reducing reliance on isolation itself. Meanwhile, public awareness grew as investigative reporting brought Angola's practices into broader national conversation about solitary confinement. Media coverage emphasized outcomes rather than ideology, focusing on documented deterioration rather than abstract debates about punishment. This shift mattered because it reframed silence as an operational risk, not simply a moral issue, forcing administrators to consider liability alongside discipline. Internal correspondence revealed concern about litigation exposure, signaling that institutional priorities were beginning to shift under external pressure. Yet progress remained uneven, with some units adopting changes, while others continued operating under long-standing routines. Staff training lagged behind policy updates, leaving officers uncertain how to manage increased interaction without compromising perceived control. This uncertainty fueled resistance, as silence had long been equated with predictability in an environment where unpredictability carried serious consequences. Still, the cumulative evidence altered internal discussions, introducing language about mental health preservation alongside security maintenance. For incarcerated men, the experience remained fragmented, with some receiving limited relief while others continued enduring extended quiet without consistent review. The second major reveal emerged here. Silence had become institutional habit, deeply embedded in workflow, making reform far more complex than issuing new rules. As Angola navigated this transition, oversight agencies demanded measurable benchmarks rather than policy statements, increasing accountability pressure. Administrators began tracking isolation duration more closely, a change that quietly acknowledged the practice's potential harm. These records would later become central to evaluating whether reduced silence correlated with fewer crises and disciplinary escalations. Yet during this period, outcomes remained mixed, leaving unresolved whether Angola could truly abandon silence as a primary control mechanism. What remained clear was that once exposed, silence could no longer operate invisibly, forcing the institution into a prolonged period of adjustment and scrutiny. The consequences of this exposure would extend beyond Angola, influencing broader conversations about isolation across American prison systems. But within the prison, the immediate question persisted. Could order be maintained without relying on enforced quiet as its foundation? The answer was still forming, shaped daily by decisions made in housing units far from public view. As reforms advanced unevenly, the legacy of silence continued shaping behavior, policy, and risk within Angola's walls. The story now turned toward outcomes, examining whether these changes reduced harm or merely shifted its form under new administrative language. By the time reforms reached daily operations, silence had already reshaped habits, expectations, and responses, making change less about policy announcements and more about undoing years of conditioned behavior. At Louisiana State Penitentiary, administrators confronted a reality where isolation was no longer invisible, but a documented variable tied to risk, liability, and institutional performance. Federal monitoring and legal settlements required measurable reductions in prolonged segregation, forcing the prison to redefine when silence was justified and how long it could legally continue. This shift introduced new tracking systems, mandating regular reviews, mental health screenings, and written justification for continued isolation beyond defined time thresholds. For the first time, silence had an expiration date, transforming it from an open-ended condition into a regulated, time-bound measure subject to external evaluation. Implementation proved uneven, revealing how deeply silence had been woven into operational routines across housing units and staff hierarchies. Some officers adapted quickly, learning to manage increased interaction without relying on quiet as default control, while others struggled with the loss of a familiar stabilizing tool. Training programs expanded to address communication, de-escalation, and mental health awareness, acknowledging that silence alone could no longer serve as primary management strategy. Early data showed modest reductions in crisis incidents within units, where interaction increased gradually and predictably rather than abruptly. However, other units reported temporary spikes in disciplinary issues, highlighting the challenge of transitioning away from long-established practices. These mixed outcomes fueled debate over whether silence had suppressed behavior or merely postponed its expression until conditions changed. Medical staff reported improved responsiveness among some prisoners, noting better communication during evaluations once regular conversation resumed. Yet long-term effects lingered, with some individuals continuing to exhibit difficulty engaging, trusting, or concentrating even after extended periods outside isolation. These findings reinforced expert testimony that silence's impact often outlasted its duration, complicating efforts to measure reform success quickly. Nationally, Angola's experience became part of a broader reassessment of solitary confinement across American prison systems. Policymakers referenced documented outcomes rather than ideology, using data from oversight periods to justify limits on prolonged isolation. Several states adopted similar review requirements, reflecting a shift toward treating silence as a risk factor rather than a neutral condition. Within Angola, accountability mechanisms tightened, requiring supervisors to verify that interaction standards were met consistently rather than selectively. This change altered internal culture, making silence something to be explained rather than assumed. For incarcerated men, daily life slowly incorporated more predictable contact, structured movement, and monitored communication opportunities. While conditions remained restrictive, the absence of absolute quiet reduced uncertainty, allowing routines to include human exchange rather than enforced isolation alone. Former prisoners later described these changes as partial but meaningful, emphasizing that predictability mattered as much as freedom within confinement. Still, not everyone benefited equally, as resource limitations and staffing shortages constrained consistent implementation across the prison's vast population. Critics argue that reforms focus more on compliance than transformation, leaving underlying incentives for isolation largely intact. Supporters countered that visibility itself was progress, reducing the likelihood that silence could again operate without scrutiny. What became clear was that silence could no longer function as a hidden mechanism, shielded from measurement or consequence. Angola's records now reflected an institution adjusting under observation, documenting decisions that once required no explanation. This transparency altered risk calculations, as administrators weighed the cost of isolation against potential legal and medical repercussions. The long-term impact extended beyond policy, reshaping how control, safety, and order were defined within correctional management. Silence, once equated with stability, now carried documented associations with harm, forcing reconsideration of its role. For staff, this meant learning to manage complexity rather than suppress it through absence of sound or interaction. For incarcerated men, it meant existing within a system that acknowledged, at least partially, the need for human engagement. The transformation was incomplete, uneven, and ongoing, reflecting the difficulty of reversing practices sustained for decades. Yet the trajectory had changed, moving away from unquestioned quiet toward monitored restraint. Angola's experience demonstrated that silence could be regulated, measured, and challenged rather than accepted as inevitable. The broader lesson reached beyond one prison, influencing how isolation was discussed within courts, legislatures, and oversight agencies. Silence had lost its invisibility, becoming evidence rather than assumption within correctional policy debates. What remained unresolved was how fully institutions could replace it without creating new forms of harm. The answer continues evolving, shaped by data, accountability, and a recognition that absence of sound can carry consequences as real as violence. Inside Angola, the legacy of enforced quiet remains embedded in memory, procedure, and reform efforts still underway. The prison's history shows how control mechanisms, once normalized, can persist until measured against their outcomes. Silence became a weapon not through intent alone, but through duration, neglect, and lack of oversight. Once exposed, its effects demanded response, altering the course of policy within one of America's most scrutinized prisons. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.